Robbers disappeared during a heist at my bank, and now the spirits want to protect us. My co-workers and I must find a way to coexist with them to keep the bank safe. I've spent nearly 20 years working as a teller at Riverbank Savings. The bank is as old as the town, with its own share of legends, including a failed heist from decades ago that supposedly ended in a massacre. Most of us wrote those off as just spooky tales to scare the new hires. But after what went down last Friday, I'm not so sure anymore. That day started off just like any other. We were nearing closing time when I noticed 5 guys hanging around outside. They didn't belong, and a cold shiver crept up my spine. I tried to shake it off and focus on my work, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me. Then, all of a sudden, they burst in, guns drawn, shouting at everyone to get down. The place erupted into chaos. Customers screamed, and I hit the deck behind the counter, my heart pounding in my ears. Amanda and Joe, my co-workers, were paralyzed with fear, and Mr. Davis, our manager, looked like he was about to drop. "Everybody down! Now!" the leader commanded, a tall guy with a voice that sent chills down your spine. Joe stumbled as he got up to open the vault, his hands shaking so much that he could barely punch in the code. The robbers spread out, one heading straight for Mr. Davis's office, another stalking through the lobby, keeping a close watch on us. Just as Joe finally got the vault open, the lights flickered and then cut out completely. Panic surged through the room. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could turn it on, a scream tore through the darkness. When the lights flickered back on, one of the robbers was sprawled on the floor, his throat slashed, blood spreading out around him. The rest of the gang looked stunned, their guns swinging in every direction, trying to make sense of it. "What the hell just happened?" the leader barked, his voice now tinged with fear. None of us had an explanation. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. "Get back to it!" the leader snapped at his crew, struggling to keep control. "We're getting out of here." The lights flickered again, throwing us back into darkness. Another scream echoed, bouncing off the walls. When the lights returned, another robber was gone. Not dead, just vanished. The 3 remaining robbers were visibly shaken. The leader was trying to hold it together, but fear was written all over his face. He shouted commands, trying to get his men to hurry. But the atmosphere in that old bank had shifted. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. The power went out again, and this time, I felt something cold brush against my arm in the pitch black. I stifled a scream, fumbling with my phone to cast a dim light. The shadows seemed to twist and wriggle, and I caught fleeting glimpses of movement shapes that didn't belong. When the lights flickered back on, the leader's right-hand man was lying on the floor, his face twisted in terror, his body covered in what looked like claw marks. The leader cursed loudly, backing away, his gun shaking in his hand. "Enough!" he yelled. "We're out of here, now!" But it seemed the power had other ideas. The lights went out once more, leaving us in total darkness. This time, I heard a low, guttural growl, something that felt ancient and primal. The remaining robbers screamed, their voices blending into a chaotic, terrifying symphony. When the lights came back on, only the leader was left standing. He was in the center of the room, his eyes wild, his gun hanging uselessly at his side. He turned slowly, his gaze locking on each of us, his face ghostly pale and haunted. What is this place?" he muttered, more to himself than to any of us. Before anyone could respond, the power went out again. This time the darkness felt suffocating, absolute. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the leader's ragged breathing, the frantic shuffle of his feet as he stumbled through the room, and then silence. When the lights flickered back on, the leader was gone. The bank was eerily silent, the only sounds being the faint hum of machinery and the soft sobs of terrified customers. Amanda and Joe were huddled together, their faces as pale as mine felt. I slowly got to my feet, my legs trembling, and made my way to the front door. It was locked from the outside, but the robbers had left their tools behind. I fumbled with the lock, finally managing to get the door open. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows as they barked orders. They found the bodies of the robbers, but there was no sign of the leader or the other 2. The investigators were at a loss, their faces grim as they tried to piece together what had happened. I gave my statement, but I kept quiet about the strange power outages and the shadows. I knew no one would believe me. Heck, I barely believed it myself. The bank stayed closed for a week while they conducted their investigation. When we finally reopened, the place felt different. The old building seemed more oppressive, the shadows darker, the air heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. One evening, as I was locking up, Amanda approached me. She looked as exhausted as I felt, dark circles under her eyes and a haunted look on her face. "Jake, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. I nodded, leading her to the break room where we could speak privately. She shut the door behind us and took a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "The nightmares, the constant feeling of being watched. I don't think it's just in our heads." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" "I did some digging," she continued, her hands trembling. "There was a robbery here decades ago, but it wasn't just a robbery. It was a massacre. The robbers killed everyone in the bank and then turned on each other. People say the place is haunted by their spirits, trapped here, seeking revenge." A cold chill ran down my spine. "And you think what happened last Friday? It was them," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure of it. The spirits of those who died in that massacre. They're still here, and they're protecting this place." I wanted to brush off her words as nonsense, but deep down, I knew she was right. The events of that night, the unexplainable deaths, the oppressive atmosphere, it all pointed to something supernatural. "We need to do something," Amanda said, desperation in her voice. "We need to find a way to put the spirits to rest." I nodded, though I had no idea where to even start. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. So when I got home, I dove into researching the history of that botched robbery. I uncovered old news clippings that described the horrific deaths and the persistent rumors of hauntings that followed. I even found similar cases, places where violent events had left behind restless spirits that refused to move on. The more I read, the more certain I became that Amanda was onto something. The next day at work, the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. Every flicker of shadow seemed to carry a hidden threat. Every little sound felt magnified. Customers went about their business, completely oblivious to the unseen horrors lurking in the old bank. After closing, Amanda, Joe, and I gathered to discuss our next steps. We debated bringing in a priest or a medium, someone who could help us deal with the spirits that haunted the place. But finding someone who actually believed in the supernatural and was willing to help wasn't going to be easy. Just as we were deep in conversation, the lights went out again. We froze, the terror from that night surging back to the surface. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a pale, eerie glow over the room. "We need to leave now," Joe said, his voice trembling with fear. But before we could even make a move, the temperature dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath misting in the frigid air. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the room, and the shadows around us seemed to writhe and twist with life. "We're not alone," Amanda whispered, her eyes wide with terror. From the darkened corner of the room, a figure emerged, its form distorted and grotesque. It was one of the robbers, his face twisted in a mask of anger and pain. He advanced toward us, his eyes glowing with hatred. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Amanda's arm and pulling her toward the door. We stumbled through the dimly lit halls, the figure pursuing us relentlessly. The old building seemed to morph around us, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching out like grasping hands. We reached the front door, but it was sealed shut, as though the bank itself wanted to keep us trapped inside. "Help! Somebody help us!" Joe shouted, pounding desperately on the door. The figure's icy fingers brushed against my back, sending a jolt of terror through me. I turned and swung my flashlight wildly, but it passed right through the spirit. It let out a furious wail, and I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest as if something was clawing at my heart. "Keep going!" I shouted, pushing Amanda and Joe toward the back exit. We ran through the labyrinth of corridors, the spirit hot on our heels. The building seemed to twist and warp, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. We finally reached the back door, and with a last, desperate effort, we forced it open. We tumbled outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air a welcome relief. The spirit stopped at the threshold, its eyes still burning with malice as it watched us from the shadows. "We need to get help," Amanda said, her voice shaking with fear. I nodded, though I wasn't sure who we could turn to. The police would never believe our story. A priest or a medium seemed like our only option. But as I looked back at the ominous bank building, an idea began to form in my mind. "Hold on," I said, stopping Amanda and Joe. What if we don't try to get rid of them?" Joe looked at me in confusion. "What do you mean?" "What if we use them?" I suggested, my voice surprisingly calm despite the fear that still gripped me. "What if we let the spirits protect the bank from future robbers?" Amanda's eyes widened as the idea took hold. "You mean, let them stay? Harness their anger to keep others out?" I nodded. "It's not the perfect solution, but it's obvious they don't want anyone stealing from this place again. If we can figure out a way to communicate with them, maybe we can coexist." Joe looked unsure, but Amanda slowly nodded. "It could work. We'd need to find a way to communicate with them, make them understand that we're not their enemies." Over the next few days, we threw ourselves into researching ways to talk to spirits. We found an old book in the library that suggested using objects from the time of the haunting to create a connection. We gathered some old coins and documents from the bank's archives and set up a small altar in the break room. That night, we stayed late again, the building silent and heavy with anticipation. We carefully placed the items on the altar and lit a candle, sitting around it in a circle. "We come in peace," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "We know what happened here, and we understand your pain. We're not here to drive you away, we want to strike a deal." The air around us grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in tighter. A soft whisper echoed through the room, brushing against our minds like a cold breeze. "We'll let you stay," Amanda said, her voice steady. "We won't disturb you, and we'll keep the bank just as it is. All we ask in return is that you protect this place from anyone who means it harm." The whisper grew louder, a chorus of overlapping voices filled with anger and betrayal. But slowly, the tone began to shift. There was something else there. Something like acceptance. The candle flickered, and the shadows seemed to pull back slightly. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the oppressive weight that had been hanging over us lifted a little. "They agree," Joe whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They'll stay and protect the bank." In the weeks that followed, we noticed a subtle but definite change in the atmosphere. The bank still had its eerie, haunted feel, but the suffocating sense of dread had eased. Customers continued to come and go, oblivious to the unseen protectors watching over them. And we, the staff, learned to live alongside the spirits of the past. We never had another robbery. The spirits made sure of that. The few times anyone tried, they met the same grisly fate as the robbers from that cursed night. Eventually, the police stopped investigating, dismissing the incidents as accidents or unexplained disappearances. We kept our secret close, never speaking of it outside our little group. The bank carried on, silently guarded by the restless spirits, and while the shadows still danced and the air still grew cold, we knew we were safe. The spirits of Riverbank Savings had found a new purpose, and in their eternal vigilance, they watched over us all.